Welcome everybody to the latest installment in our UXDX Online series. And again, this week we're going to be at product strategy. We have two really exciting speakers lined up for you today, but I want to give a very introduction to share what it is that we do at UXDX and what we're trying to achieve with these sessions. And then I'll get out of the way and hand you over to the speakers for the. So to start with, our mission at UXDX is to help companies move from working in waterfall projects to continuous empowered product teams. And the reason why that is our mission is because we believe it's a more efficient, effective, and sustainable way of working in high kind of change environments that a lot of us are working in these days. But one thing that we do want to call out is the problem with waterfall is often that it's being imposed on teams. And I put kind of Scrum and a few of those other processes more into the waterfall bucket than the agile one, because it's often water, scrum, fall, or something along those lines. And it's one size doesn't fit all. So a lot of companies have a process and then they try to enforce that process for every project around the company. And what's actually kind of shown is that in a low change environment, it makes sense to follow a waterfall process. Don't have a team sitting there just twiddling their thumbs waiting for something to come along. Disband a team, wait until you have some requirements, create a team specifically with the experts for that, disband the team again. It's not efficient in terms of people and code. It does lead to the tragedy of the commons where a lot of the code starts to degrade over time, but that makes sense in that low change environment. It isn't worth paying the tax of having a functional kind of cross-functional team. But if you're in a high change environment, that's when the economics shift. And it actually makes more sense to have a team continuously delivering small incremental changes, learning and iterating, because you can do a much better job that way. It is more expensive, but if you're in that high change environment, then it makes sense. Now, that's kind of an easy thing to say, oh, we'll move from kind of one-off project continuous teams, but it's actually quite a dramatic change for everyone involved, whether it's the people kind of authorizing the projects or whether it's the people working on them. And just focusing in on the people working on the projects, in a waterfall world, you have your specialists, you have your product manager, you have your interaction designer, your UX researcher, your kind of front-end engineers, your back-end engineers, your QA, your data specialists, all of the different kind of specializations, architects, etc. But when you move to a cross-functional team to get to 8 or 9 people as a maximum, there's too many roles in a traditional project to fit into those 8 or 9. So what needs to happen is people need to take on multiple roles. And that's what we're trying to do here with all of our sessions is, particularly in our conferences, on these online sessions, focus on a particular topic, but in our conferences, we're very much cross-functional, getting people from product, UX design and dev together. And because the idea is that you have a specialization, and that's your deep kind of specialization, but you need your cross understanding, so your T-shaped skills, or combs, as some people may say, where you have multiple specialities. And that's important in a cross-functional team, because you can't just be, I'm an interaction designer or I'm a front-end engineer. You have to be able to help out and move across the team to see where the work is needed most. And then the other problem that we try to solve is that a lot of these things are great in theory, but sometimes doing it is a lot more difficult than the theory suggests. So what we therefore ask is, a lot of our speakers, we say, can we give a lot of examples or share a bit more than just the theory, share some examples of how you put this in practice and the challenges that you faced, so they can become a bit more real and tangible for people. So with that, hopefully you will have questions as we go on throughout the day. So please do ask them on the chat on the right, or wherever you're watching from. And we'll put those questions to the speakers. And if we don't have time, we have the Slack channel, the UXDX community Slack channel, where we have an Ask the Speakers channel where you can put any questions that we didn't get time to cover in there. But that kind of gives you a quick overview of where we're at now. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get hold of Sergey. So hopefully he'll be able to join us later on in the day. But we're actually going to jump forward to our second speaker of the day. So we're just going to flip the order of our speakers today, and we'll be starting with Nathan Henry, who's the head of product management at Postlight. And Nathan is going to be talking about plan for failure to ensure success. So welcome, Nathan.
Welcome. Thanks so much.
Great. So if you can just share your screen, I'll put that up and then we can get started. Great. So over to you, Nathan. Thank you.
Sounds great. I'm having technical. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Works perfect on my end.
Okay. Sounds great. Thanks so much. Well, appreciate having a chance to speak. My name is Nathan Henry, pronouns are he, him, and I'm the head of product management at Postlight. It's a digital strategy, design, and engineering firm in New York City. And I'm so excited to speak now about planning and success. As we know, every good product is made up by a series of decisions that rely on best known evidence at the time. But when we product managers rally with our designers and our engineering partners to make decisions on behalf of what's best for users, we bias ourselves towards positive outcomes. And that's the right default orientation, but it's only solving half of the problem. So there is the blank space of opportunity of planning for negative outcomes, which means that we can avoid mistakes that are predictable failures and that we aren't safeguarded against first. So as I was preparing for today, I found a quote that I just had to share because it actually summarized this better than I could say. So it's a quote from Taylor Swift, and it says, "Just because you made a good plan doesn't mean that's what's going to happen." Honestly, I just think that's the core of what we want to do here. We want to plan for everything that we can, but we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. So what I do want to say to start this presentation is that we should be hopeful. We should ship great products. But we should also know that our best laid plans hardly ever pan out the way that we want. So then what? How do we move forward? How do we get our new definition of success? And what will our clients think? How will our customers respond? So those are all great questions, and I'm hoping that we can shed some light on this topic today to give some mindset shifts. So first and foremost, I just want to say, planning to fail, it isn't negative or defeatist. It's just realism. The first tip here for today, it's a mindset shift. A strong PM knows all too well that no product is ever built without mistakes or bugs or stakeholder issues or risk. That's just what we're going to expect. So why not lean into that a little bit while planning? We often ask, how might we? But what about also asking, and if that doesn't work, then what? If that fails, how will we? So push back also on bold statements. Anyone that says, oh, this is easy, or that's just an edge case. True, we don't want to solve for every known problem, but focusing on what could go wrong with our solutioning actually points out risk and holes in the problem that we're attempting to solve. So before we dive in a little bit more, I think I should give some background on myself. I have a different background. PMs all come in different sizes and shapes, of course. So for me, my influential time of my 20s and 30s was spent working in a 911 emergency call center. So my worldview is on disaster planning and crisis response. Admittedly, that's a bias that I bring. With that, life or death was often in the decisions and risk mitigation planning that I had to make. That was oftentimes spur of the moment. If I think about this as a product, my product was help or safety. My users were usually ill or in distress or victims of a just committed crime. My features, so the tools I had available, were police, firefighters, medics, and then over-the-phone tips and tactics such as administering CPR or hostage negotiation. That's something I've actually used before. I became a master of asking questions and eliciting information. And I use this information to make split-second, life-changing decisions. Most of the time, I shipped success, but sometimes I didn't. Sometimes a bad outcome happened. So that's my worldview. And I think the important part of the story is bad stuff will happen. But fortunately for us, it's just software, and it's a bug. It's not death. So how does crisis management scale to software? Well, let me talk to you about how I think this is important in a learning that I took in my life. So back in my 911 days, we had what we would call frequent flyers. And so these are folks that would call repeatedly. There's one person in particular I'm thinking of. She never had an emergency. She often called. Someone was smoking cigarettes too close to her home, or the neighbor's vacuum cleaner was too loud, things that were just clearly not emergency, not super important. So over the course of time, her user behavior was defined through a series of interviews with predictable outcomes, very much nascent in terms of what the typical problem would be. But one day she called and she was having a medical emergency. And I've had bias, and this is the thing that I learned on this day. So when I saw her name and address pop up on the computer-aided dispatch display, I immediately settled into sort of my routine normalcy of calm questions. In my head, I was thinking, well, I'll start a report, I'll clear the ticket, no big deal. But I learned quickly her behavior had changed and her needs had evolved. So I had to respond immediately to this new requirement, this new user story, if you will. In the end, everything was fine. She was okay. And that happy outcome, it was transformative for me because I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't prepared for this new requirement. My mindset was set on routine and expected outcomes and behaviors, and just really kind of not thinking through what might happen when I take that call, what could be the outcome of what that user needs. So I really took this as an opportunity to sort of shake it off and reset. So kind of applying that lens to crisis management and thinking about software, a few things that I'd like to talk through today is really focusing on outcomes over outputs. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what does success look like, but I also want to think about what does failure look like? How would we plan for that? What shape might that take? We know the outcomes that we want. We know the outcomes that we don't want, but we might get them anyway. And so we should start to plan and talk about what those actually look like. So apply a lens of the unexpected. A framework to think about this is in your users. Outputs is what you end up with after a series of inputs. Your inputs can be decisions, it can be effort, it can be features, but outcomes are what you're given and what you're left with at the end of the day. So outcomes are what you desire and the thing that you can most influence. You can influence this by influencing your users. You can change patterns. You can elicit motivations. You can begin to change goals and actions. The other part here is that as you do start to change outputs, your user behaviors likely will change. So think through a product when you're first designing a product. As you start discovering research, behaviors are completely undefined. But as you learn more, you begin to predict behaviors and begin to start solving for them. Your product decisions are set out on how to support a goal that your user is aiming to achieve. But those users evolve and their needs will change. You should set clear goal lines as to what you will solve for, because you obviously want to make sure that your scope is controlled. But also have some variability within those features to create experiences that will scale as your users' needs evolve. Last thing here is the evolution of your customer needs. So for instance, as we all know, any company's main goal usually is revenue, and that's usually driven by adoption and continued engagement. But as your software is being designed and built, has the landscape changed? Has your users evolved? Think globally about factors that could create a recipe for failure. So taking this through, I'd like to talk through a case study for something that I've recently shipped. So I worked with the National Audubon Society, and just a couple months ago, we shipped just a gorgeous web app, if I may say so, called the Bird Migration Explorer. It was a 20-month program. It was multi-phased. It's one of the most technically complicated products with the largest data set that I've ever been part of. So planning was paramount to our success here. End of the story first, we did launch on time, and the launch was boring, which is exactly what you want. But how did we get there? We planned. We had to plan a lot, and there's a lot of considerations. The key hallmark of this app is the aggregation of data. There's bird tracking data, bird banding data, abundance data, occurrence data, GIS data. I could just keep going on and on. The headline here is that these interactive animated maps paint the full annual migration for 458 bird species. And to do so, we have more than 4.2 million point-to-point migratory bird connections across the Western Hemisphere. So that's just one piece of data that we're showing, but there's a whole bunch of subsets here. But one of the tricky factors in our planning was that the Audubon Society doesn't actually outright own all the data. Actually, no one entity does. So we had to find partnerships and agreements, and we designed and built our app around having access to all of this data that we needed. We planned for success. Designs included these programs. The architecture and the schema supported having all of this data available. But what if we didn't get the data? What if we missed one piece? What if we didn't get any of it? How could I evolve my product vision to support the failure of obtaining this key data, integral data to our visual narrative? We had clear plans for how we could evolve the story for any missing data or all of the data, and still a plan to support users if our agreements weren't successful. This was done through planning, expecting different scenarios. We had contingencies, we had safeguards, and we had plans. Ultimately, we did get access to all the data, so failed plannings weren't needed. Additionally, our behaviors changed in our users. We first identified when we started this two primary users, birders and conservationists, so scientists. Both are well-versed in migratory birds. They understand taxonomy and guild and other attributes. But what if our mapping data and visualizations just weren't enough to keep those users interested? What if we failed to create a compelling reason to engage users to return to the website? This lens about thinking about not good enough or not offering a deep enough experience created some new features, and it also downscoped others, both of which added to the overall experience. We found ways to engage new users, and this is a personal story. As we're thinking of bird nerds and scientific conservationists, we wanted to also find use cases to get new folks into the app. So my target user became my mom. So the tooling that we eventually offered and came out with supports my mom watching birds in her backyard in rural Illinois, as well as these bird nerds and these scientific conservationists. So long story short, by thinking of how we may fail our users, we found ways to support their needs even more, and we actually even created new target segments for engagement. So one thing that I really love about UXDX is evolving from project thinking into product thinking. And that aligns really well with how I approach product and how I lead teams. Without being negative or sort of seeking, as an anti-hero, I want to just ask some different questions, and I want to put a framework in place of how we might think about mitigating challenges. So a lot of times we focus on what does success look like? What is our MVP? What's the definition of done? And what does a successful launch look like? Those are all great questions, absolutely wonderful questions. But at the same time, we want to validate, thinking about more around success, we want to mitigate challenges along the way. So we have to validate all of our decisions for recovery against our product requirements to ensure that we have a bulletproof user story and solid acceptance criteria. So more than just a backlog or a story point. In order to do that, we want our features to be really well-rounded and fully vetted. So I actually like to think about other questions such as, what does failure look like? What could go wrong? And plan for that. What does our MFP? I just thought this was kind of fun. So our most failed product, like what is the worst thing we could put out there and how do we not do that? Like plan to not do that. When is done enough good enough? Scope control is also extremely important. We don't want to continue to solve all the problems for all the users. We want to have some controls, but we also need to balance the line of being good enough, but also being done. And then what stops us from launching? So what are roadblocks that we might anticipate, and how do we start to handle getting ahead of those? If you don't plan for outcomes that include all possible outcomes, you're basically telling your users, hey, you're on your own, kid. You don't want to look back at your clients with a failed launch thinking about would have, could have, and should have. You want to think through what works. You want to plan for failure. So as we continue to move through our planning for failure, you're probably thinking to yourself, you need to calm down. Like this is software. This isn't 911. There's no hostage happening here. And you're right. Not everything is that bad. But these tips can help you ship a safer, better, faster, more inclusive, and scalable product. So this is just a bullet point of some things that came through. Again, we started with a mindset shift, but I also want to make sure that we're clear here that this is not just being negative. This is not being defeatist. So don't dwell in despair. When I think of client engagements, they're really exciting in that honeymoon phase during that project kickoff where the world is possible and there's eternal hope and you're going to do all the things that you want to do. Like enjoy that, be in that moment, celebrate that time, because eventually an invisible string and an unknown constraint will show up. It's how you handle that and plan for that will undermine your path to success. So when something does happen that is unexpected, it's okay. You've planned for something bad to happen. You know it's going to happen. So enjoy the discomfort. And I know that seems like an awkward place to stay, but discomfort is a wake-up call that things aren't going well and that you need to find a way out of the woods. Sure, you could run to the nearest daylight, but you could be running further into harm's way. Instead, stay in that moment and really analyze, why is there discomfort? What happened that led the team to this place? What went awry? What could go differently next time? How did my actions contribute to us being in this place? When you have all that data, you'll be able to then lead your team to the best safety, which might not be the closest safety. The third item here is be reasonable. You can't plan for everything. I can't imagine anyone would have predicted COVID changing our world, or catastrophes or natural disasters. So you don't have to be a doomsdayist here. Scope to your planning for what you might expect, and not global emergencies. So there is some normalcy here. Rely but don't die on data. Data is historical, and why data is great is the lesson in what suggesting what the future might be. But it doesn't guarantee the future. It doesn't construct how you'll get there. Data also sometimes has gaps and biases, and users aren't data, they're humans. And humans are very complex. So humans will always foil best laid plans. Iterate often. See things in a different way. Ask users different questions. Hear feedback and show new paths. User testing is the best real-world sample for your product that you can ever ask for. And believe what they tell you. If they're having an issue with something, it's probably not working for them, and you might want to go back and figure it out. Think of obstacles, not just opportunities. If we want to action a particular piece, what might get in our way? What could prevent the user from completing this action? It's easy to understand, click this button, launch this screen, but think through the other way. How would the user not find that button? What if the user doesn't want to engage with that call to action? Those types of things to sort of find these patterns. And finally, turn the how might we into the what if this. Not all planning is disaster, is life or death, but the mindset shift is similar, and it'll pay rewards to your team and your product. And there's a quote that I like to think of through here, is also being a tennis fan. As you enter into the halls of Wimbledon, there's a quote from Kipling that says, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same, I believe that in those moments, you will have earned your reputation as someone who delivers client and customer confidence in their product. Hopefully these tips will be helpful. I'd love to answer any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you very much, Nathan. I have a few thoughts that come up on our platform as well. So I might just jump in with my one, because I really like the concept of kind of looking at all of the ways it can fail. How was it put? It was kind of have a pre-mortem for your project at the start to go, okay, it died. So how did it die? But is there a risk in doing this? The concept, or I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but the concept that there's pioneers and then there's settlers. So there's the risk takers, and then there's the people who are kind of town planners, who are kind of making sure that you've got water and sanitation and things like that. So is there a risk with this that you might kind of hold back the pioneers, and you might kind of not take as much risks as maybe you should do to get product to the next step?
I actually think it gives you a greater chance at innovation. I think why it does that is because when you are innovating, you're doing something that's new. That's the whole point. You're doing something new. You're putting a new product out there. So you should be validating that. You should be understanding those risks, so that way the team can enter in those decisions together, and that you have a known path. You also, I'm not suggesting that you don't do something. I'm just suggesting that you safeguard it as best as you can, and understand that, if you're halfway to finished and something happens, how do you pivot when there's a new learning? So I actually think it creates a safer space to be more bold and to take more chances, because if you've planned, if something bad happens, you know how to sort of pick the ball up if it gets dropped. So I agree with what you're saying, but I do think as long as the team is entering into these discussions and these debates together, they can decide together as to how they want to move forward.
Great. Yeah, I guess it's just bringing awareness to it. And you did touch on, my first one was the question that I had picked up on was, every time I do something, I try to plan for the failures, and it's always something new. It's always something I wasn't expecting that crops up and goes wrong. So how do you factor that in, that there are just these black swans that happen?
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I think, to be honest with you, it's not like I sit down and write a list of all the things that are going to fail, but it's a mindset. It's a way I approach the problem of knowing, hey, like this is going to be the cool. Like when we started, the Audubon case study, like this was going to be the coolest thing I've ever shipped. I could tell that on day one. But I also thought there's a lot of risk here. Like we want to be bold, we want to innovate in this space, we want to be really big risk takers. But to take the risk, you have to understand what comes with that. And so I really feel like it's a framework for how to approach problems. And so it's not a literal, checkbox of X thing could happen, so I'm going to solve Y thing with sort of Z, mitigation. But it's understanding as you make those risks, thinking through like it's easy, when you I'm going to make a food analogy because that's who I am. When you go to the store and you buy all the ingredients for a pie, you know what the pie is supposed to look like. You know how delicious it's going to taste. Like you can plan for success. But what happens if something fails in that recipe, right? So it's that idea of like, if something goes wrong, how do I repair it? Because I still want to have the pie. So it's really just a mindset of how will you adjust. One of the worst things that could happen is sort of this paralysis of deciding that you don't know how to go forward. Something bad has happened and you don't know what to do with it. The worst thing you can do to your clients or your users is to do nothing. You must do something. Inaction is failure. I would say that is absolutely the biggest line of failure here. So it's really the mindset to find ways to continue to move forward. Rory is having some technical difficulties, so I'm waiting for him to reconnect. I'm also checking the Slack to see if there's any questions here in the chat. Feel free to reach out with any questions for the presentation.
Apologies, internet just dropped there. Apologies for that.
It's all good. It's all good. There was an awkward minute where I was looking through Slack questions to see if there was any other questions in the Slack channel for the UXDX community.
Was
taken over.
One. Apologies. It came in, and he's asked about. So you mentioned kind of trying to track where is it good enough or those kind of things. Do you have any recommendations? You mentioned during your last question about you don't boxes. So what do you use, or what kind of tools or methods do you use for tracking that it's good enough, or how can we fail?
Yeah, I think that goes directly to sort of your scoping questions, right? And I understand, scope is always very important, but I also understand my bold claim here was to kind of push back on scope controls a bit to make sure that you're servicing the users and the problem in the right way. I think understanding truly the user's needs from that problem space, really fully understanding that all of your users' needs and how you want to solve them will allow you to sort of get into that solution space to then validate, will these solutions work? Are these the right way to build this item? Once you have that problem clearly identified and your solution clearly positioned, I think then you can allow this layer of what is an MVP, and you'll have a safer, more usable, more scalable MVP to make it its subset. I think there's also constant iteration that's necessary. I also think as your market evolves and your users change and your platform's out there and you get feedback, things become more important. Certain features do, and certain features become less important. So constantly juggling that backlog, constantly prioritizing what's important to users based on how the platform's being received, how the users have evolved. Did you find a new segment? Like all those things are going to be that constant evolution. And so what I'm proposing here is that you don't just go and build a feature complete platform and just put that out there and it'll solve everyone's needs. It's really making those smaller adjustments to identify what's necessary and what's critical, And something that was really important on day one may be completely irrelevant by day 60. It just depends on how you've been successful and how the market and the users receive your platform.
Well, I think that brings us to time exactly. So thank you very much, Nathan. I really enjoyed that. And it sings to me because I was just reading Fearless Organization, which is all about intelligent failures. So it's just perfect timing. So thank you for your insights.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan, and so it's awesome to be able to contribute to the UXDX community here. So thanks so much. I really appreciate it, Rory.
Thank you. Up next, we were supposed to have, or initially we were supposed to have Sergey and Krasotin talk about how the craziest UX ideas become successful products. Now, unfortunately, we haven't been able to get in touch with Sergey, so I do hope everything is okay with him. But what we will do is we will record his session separately at a different time, and we will just email that out to everybody who's subscribed. So I do apologize for the lack of the second talk today, but I do hope that you got a lot of interesting insights and tangible actions that you could take from Nathan's talk. So with that, we're actually going to finish a little bit early today, earlier than planned. But if you are interested in kind of digging deeper into these topics, so as I said, with UXDX, we tried to get product, UX, design, and dev together. So you can follow us in all of these free online series, or we've just released our USC conference today, if you want to join us at that, where we can all get in and have all of that kind of enthusiasm and kind of atmosphere that comes along with that. So I do hope I'll see some of you there, and looking forward to catching you again soon. So thank you very much, and thanks for joining.